You found the skeleton. How would you calculate that? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Last time we were here, we had just heard from Brian Thomas about Archaeopteryx and Homo habilis. He's going to keep talking about the latter for a bit, and we're going to hear him understand basic taxonomy, so that's fun. Before we dive into that, though, if you could take a second to subscribe and like the video, I'd really appreciate it. The algorithm is a cruel god, and is often unkind to me, but doing that can really appease it and help this channel grow. Anyway, here's Dr. Brian Thomas and Ivana Semide, whose name I am sorry for butchering, continuing to complain about Homo habilis.
So anyway, a Homo habilis, I think a lot of paleoanthropologists have called it a junk bin, where a category into which you can throw any kind of fossil.
Well, first, it's typically wastebasket, not junk bin. Second, it's not a place where you can throw anything. Wastebasket taxa have definitions that organisms need to meet in order to be placed in them. The problem is that they're often defined by things like plesiomorphic traits, which means that they tend to be polyphyletic or paraphyletic, which means we now have to talk about taxonomy. So, as you probably know, taxonomy is the system by which we name and classify organisms. You probably learned about the ranks for kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species in school. Like with many things that are taught to children at school, this is vastly oversimplified, and there is much more to taxonomy than that. But rather than get into all the other ranks like domain, subphylum, and superfamily, I want to talk about the goals of taxonomy. Taxonomy ideally should only give a name to a group of organisms as such if they are actually more similar to each other than to any other organisms not in the group, which also means that they share a more recent common ancestor with each other than with any organisms that are not in the group which we are now naming, and so making a taxon, because a taxon is any named group of organisms. What this means is that ideally all taxa should constitute a clade, that is a group of organisms, their most recent common ancestor, and all of its descendants. We call such a taxon monophyletic. Sometimes, though, humans make mistakes or are unable to fully resolve the cladistic relationships because of a lack of data. In such cases, taxa may be erected which are not terribly well defined and so are not, or are likely not, monophyletic. The two different kinds of non-monophyletic taxa are paraphyletic taxa and polyphyletic taxa. Let's start with paraphyly. This is when a taxon includes some groups of organisms, their most recent common ancestry, but not all of its descendants. An example of this would be the old version of Reptilia, which was originally a class that did not include birds, even though if you take the most distantly related living reptiles, crocodiles and lizards, say, their common ancestor also gave rise to birds. Polyphyletic taxa share a common ancestor with each other that is not in the taxon. So an example of this is the old mammal class Edentata, which used to include aardvarks, sloths, and armadillos, even though aardvarks are actually more closely related to elephants and manatees than they are to sloths and armadillos. The common ancestor of aardvarks and sloths is the same as the common ancestor of elephants and sloths, meaning that while they are both in the taxon Atlantogenata, there is no valid monophyletic taxon including the South American Atlantogenatans and also just the aardvark. So could just anything have been placed in the old taxa Reptilia or Edentata? Well, no. No one ever thought that, say, tigers should be in either. It's simply that those taxa weren't monophyletic and were assemblages of similar organisms, but there were some flaws in their definitions and our information that caused this problem. Similarly, a wastebasket taxon is poorly defined, often using basal rather than derived traits to define it. An example of this might be Condylarthra, an old class that had basically all the animals that seemed like ungulates, but that weren't obviously paracerdactyls or artiodactyls. Instead, they were defined by shared traits of ungulates, but also by not being in either the other major group of ungulate. The ungulates of South America were once in this now defunct taxon. But does that mean that those animals didn't exist, or that we can't place them in a now valid taxonomy, or that we were wrong about their anatomy? Well, no, it doesn't. The same is true for Homo habilis. H. habilis remains transitional and a part of the story of human evolution. Even if it is not found to be a monophyletic species that has to be broken into a few new species, each transitional individual remains transitional no matter what we eventually call it, and no matter how valid or not H. habilis is as a taxon, it won't make the actual transitional anatomy go away.
But every example of it is so fragmentary that you can't draw any solid conclusions from it.
Except that we can put fragments together. That's a thing.
And what fragments we do have of either human or ape bones that are categorized as Homo habilis, mostly human.
Well, since humans are apes, I don't know what that means. It's like saying that something is a transition from a reptile to a lizard. It's nonsense. But H. habilis is an important transition between late genus Australopithecus and early genus Homo, and that will remain true even if it turns out to be a wastebasket, because the fossils currently assigned to the taxon will still be transitional no matter what happens to the taxon itself.
Those are actually just humans.
But what does that mean? They fall well outside the known diversity for Homo sapiens, so they don't seem to be the same species as modern humans. What makes a human a human? At the narrowest sense, we could say that humans are members of the human species, H. sapiens. We could go broader and say that any animal in genus Homo is a human, in which case no one is really contesting that Homo habilis is human, and this is not a problem at all for evolution. But it seems like we're somewhere in the middle. Remember, Thomas wants to dismiss most of the bones of H. habilis as non-human ape bones, which means that he rejects the classification of these bones as human, meaning we're left without a working definition for human that could make his statement mean anything. This is the problem with using common terms for organisms in science. In normal conversation, you don't really need to be very careful when using the word human. Humans are a very distinct group within the modern world, and there's nothing out there that would push our boundaries of the concept of human. But that was not the case in the prehistoric past of a few million years ago, or, if you're wrong, just after the flood. So, what does it mean to be human? Well, I'm sure Thomas would say that it means to be descended from Adam and Eve, which is all well and good, except that we don't have any way to check on that from bones. So any assessment about whether a skull belonged to a human or not is going to have to be based on some kind of morphological criteria. Which means that either Thomas has such criteria in mind when he says that some animals are not humans while saying that others are, or he does not have any such criteria in mind and is simply using it dishonestly as a weasel word. I have to say that the lack of him giving or even citing any morphological definition for human seems to heavily imply that he's just using it as a weasel word.
They're already human. You know, human heads come in all kinds of different shapes, more than any of the animals.
I would say that dog skull morphological diversity far outstrips human skull morphological diversity, but also in saying this, it means that Thomas must have a range of morphological variation within which a skull can be reasonably identified as human. So, what's the range? Now, I don't really need him to give me the specific numbers in this podcast for laymen, but he should at least be able to tell interested viewers where to go to get such numbers, except they simply do not exist. The closest we came is the baronological studies that recover humans as a kind, but those aren't definitional, they're just a post hoc assignment of kind status guided by the dogmatic assertion that humans must be a kind unto themselves.
Human heads we have long, broad, narrow, so many different face shapes.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So now I'm sure he'll at least reference a place where a range of human morphological diversity in skull shape has been published such that we can compare a given skull to this and determine if it's human, right?
And the same was true with our ancestors. So people in the past had very different looking faces than some of us do today.
Something that, as far as I can tell, isn't disputed by anyone, but that doesn't help us determine if the apes in question are humans or not.
So that doesn't mean they evolved. It just means they're humans with different shaped faces.
Mm-hmm.
No, it doesn't mean that. That humans have internal morphological diversity in skull shape and always have doesn't actually mean anything for whether or not humans evolved from a common ancestor with other apes. All apes have morphological diversity and always have. Heck, interspecific diversity is actually one of the key aspects of evolutionary biology. It goes all the way back to Darwin. You can't use something that's a key aspect of evolutionary biology as a way to debunk evolutionary biology. It would be like trying to use the fact that Cyrus the Great was a real guy as a way to debunk the historicity of the Bible.
So what we need is not a story told around a collection of human fossils.
Instead, we need a story that's physically impossible and has literally no physical evidence. You know, like the primeval history from Genesis 1 through 11. That's a far better way to do science.
We need to see an actual transition. For example, the back of the skull of an ape has this big hole in it into which the spinal column connects.
It's not just hominoids, it's all craniates that have that. But okay.
And that hole is called the foramen magnum. It's in the back. It's back here.
Okay.
And so why is it in the back? Well, because they knuckle walk by habit. That's their preferred mode of locomotion, knuckle walking. So they're on all fours.
Mm-hmm.
Nope, among hylobatids, the preferred mode of locomotion is brachiation, and on the ground they move bipedally. Orangutans also prefer brachiation, although they do walk on their knuckles when on the ground. Miocene apes tended to walk on their palms, and of course hominins tend to walk upright on just the hind limbs, except as infants. Further, the apes that knuckle walk do so in different ways, indicating that it probably was not a trait present in their common ancestor, which remember, most creationists actually do think existed. They just don't think it was also an ancestor to humans.
And if the spine plugged into the bottom of the skull, if the foramen magnum, the big hole, was in the bottom of the skull, like it is in humans, then they'd be looking at the ground all the time, or craning their neck up to try to see forward as they're knuckle walking.
Yep, that's why paleoanthropologists use things like the position of the foramen magnum to determine that animals like Australopithecus walked upright. So that makes Australopithecus seem like the transition that Thomas is asking for.
In contrast, human skull has the foramen magnum on the bottom because we walk upright.
Which is typical for hominins, the taxonomic tribe to which humans belong.
So we need to see a transitional, if there's really transitional form leading from apes to humans, why don't we see, the foramen magnum migrating from the back to the bottom?
Well, in the first place, the earliest hominins seem to have walked upright, meaning that this transition was one of the first things to distinguish human-line apes from chimp-line apes. So it was already in place very early. But also, look at this picture of a chimp, Australopithecus africanus, Homo erectus, and a modern human skull put side by side. That is in fact the migration of the foramen magnum over time. So, we do see that. And the thing is that if Brian here actually did look into this, which he's claiming to have done, then there's no way he didn't find this. So either he's lying about knowing what he's talking about, or he's lying about this not being something we have in a transition from one fossil to the next. Asking for transitions in humans is one of the worst tactics that young Earth creationists can use, because the human lineage is so well attested that essentially any transition they want can be easily provided, given that the transition they want to see is one that actually would have had to happen in the evolution of humans from their common ancestor with chimpanzees. Obviously, we're not going to be able to show them a transition between, say, a bat and a human.
We don't. When we see a skull that's complete enough to even reposition the foramen magnum, it's either the ape position, like in modern apes, and in Lucy, ape position, where it's in the back of the skull.
No. Lucy's foramen magnum was closer to the human condition than the chimp condition. Brian is just lying. But also, here's the picture again. We do in fact see clear migration of the foramen magnum, and the problem isn't that we have too many alleged hominins with the basal location for the foramen magnum, it's actually the opposite. We don't have any hominins with the completely chimp-like positioning for the foramen magnum. In fact, this is why the creationist organization Reasons to Believe, the brainchild of Hugh Ross, which is an old Earth creationist organization, says that basically all hominins, even Neanderthals, are just upright walking apes that are not human. In fact, they've even said that human interbreeding with Neanderthals counts as bestiality, something I disagree with, but whatever. Of course, ICR doesn't like Reasons to Believe because the latter are old Earth creationists, meaning that while they reject evolution, they also accept the overwhelming evidence from geology and astronomy, indicating an ancient Earth and even more ancient universe.
Or that fossil skull has got the foramen magnum at the bottom. It's a human.
Actually, that could be a way to determine if an organism is human or not, if the foramen magnum is more ventrally placed than posteriorly placed. The problem is that rather than making only a handful of late hominins human, which is what Thomas wants, it makes even Ardipithecus a human. The concept of human now includes things that were basically upright chimps, which isn't really what Thomas is going for. That's a wider definition of human than any I've ever encountered, but this is a constant problem for creationists. In fact, I had a chat with a creationist where basically the whole thing was myself and Jackson Wheat trying to get him to define the term kinds and information in a way that was actually useful, and he never actually did. The reason that creationists so rarely actually define things, and when they do they often define them in non-standard ways, is because if they were to give definitions to words like kind, human, fitness, beneficial, deleterious, or information that were both scientifically useful and in line with how the terms are actually used in science, it would become very clear very quickly that their ideas just don't hold water. For example, there isn't any scientifically useful definition for information that can be applied to DNA that doesn't result in DNA being able to gain information in very obvious and observable ways. So creationists just keep it vague. There is no way to define a kind that doesn't just come down to special pleading. Human is similar. Once we define human, we can actually test to see if something is human or show how it's becoming human. And when we do that, we can see that human evolution is extremely obviously true. In fact, it even happened with this definition for humans, which caused nearly all of the fossil hominins to suddenly become human, even the most ape-like. If creationism has any validity, it wouldn't need to rely on weasel words and leaving important concepts undefined so that they never actually have to be defended in any rigorous way.
So we see either or when evolution is looking for that transition of almost and becoming.
Yeah.
Even if that were true, which it's not, it would actually harm the case of young Earth creationism. So this was a bad move from a tactical standpoint for Thomas.
But the real world is really bucking against the philosophy of transitional forms.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
First, there is no absence of transitional forms. Second, there is no particular need for them, at least as fossils. The genetic and morphological evidence for common ancestry is conclusive on its own. Third, accurately describing the anatomy of a transitional form and then doing statistical analysis on potential phylogenies isn't storytelling. It's literally what science is: observation, data gathering, and hypothesis testing.
So in the absence of actual transitional features, there's desperate attempts to tell stories to backfill the need for transitional forms.
Well, he need wait no longer, because all transitional forms have transitional features. But I think he knows that. Let me know what you think in the comments. Is he stupid or lying? I suspect he's lying, because he managed to get a real PhD. I guess it's okay to lie if you're doing it for Jesus, right?
But I'm waiting for some scientist to say, here it is, a transitional feature in this transitional form, instead of just saying, here it is, a transitional form with stories.
Disregarding that fully formed, near as I can tell, means literally nothing at all, and is just there as a way for creationists to weasel out of accepting any transitional fossil, we have dozens of species and hundreds of individuals demonstrating the transition. The transition is so smooth that we can't even figure out a rigorous way to say where Australopithecus stops and Homo begins. Indeed, the transition is so smooth and gradual that there are some paleoanthropologists that even say that calling it a transition at all gives the wrong impression, noting that modern humans are just a continuation of trends in hominin evolution that have carried through the whole lineage, and that humans today are not really qualitatively different than Lucy.
Yeah. So just to be clear, we don't have any evidence of a fully formed, that link between the human and the apes. So you're saying when we find things, it's just fragments of something that they think is the transitional form, but there's not a fully formed anything out there.
The use of the word fragment here is curious to me. I'm not sure what she means by it. On the one hand, she might mean that the specimens we have come from only a few tiny bone fragments, and that there are no hominin specimens that have a large portion of the skeleton preserved. If that is what she means, then she's just wrong. We have very complete skeletons from many hominins, although not all. Also, we have whole skulls, whole vertebral columns, whole pelvises, etc. We know what these animals look like for the most part, given the limitations of working entirely with skeletal remains. She might also mean that the remains that we do find are often broken into pieces regardless of how much of the skeleton we actually have. This is actually usually, although not always, true. But in these cases, the bone fragments form a puzzle. Just like with a jigsaw puzzle, even one with a few missing pieces, for most of the pieces you can figure out exactly how they fit together and reconstruct what the picture is, even without knowing what it is in advance. For example, KNMER 1813, the most complete Homo habilis skull, was broken into quite a few pieces, but someone trained in anatomy can put them back together, and we know with high confidence what the whole skull looked like as a result. Sure, you could call that fragmentary, but so what? We can put it back together. And if the creationists want to claim it was done wrong, then they can attempt their own reconstruction and get it past peer review. If not, then they are just whining about science doing science without bothering to participate. Of course, that's their general modus operandi, so that's what I expect they'll keep doing.
There's no example I know of a transitional form that actually has a transitional feature associated with it.
Well, let's look at the tooth row of a chimpanzee, an Australopithecus, and a human. You'll notice that the human tooth row is parabolic in shape and has no post-canine diastema. The chimpanzee tooth row has a noticeable diastema posterior to the canines, and the anterior portion is mostly in a straight line, as are the premolars and molars, which are mostly parallel to each other and approximately orthogonal to the incisors, with the teeth marking the point where the angles changed being the canine teeth. Those teeth are also much larger in the chimpanzee than in the human. Well, the Australopithecus, while closer to the chimpanzee condition, is in fact transitional. For one thing, the canines are significantly reduced, being closer in that aspect to the human teeth, but also the diastema posterior to those canines is reduced, and all sections of the tooth row have a noticeable but subtle curve, bringing the tooth row away from being completely boxy like in the chimpanzee and bringing it closer to the parabolic tooth row in modern humans. Also, as we've already seen, the position of the foramen magnum in Australopithecus is also transitional. But hey, the face of Australopithecus is also flatter, or more platycephalic, which is just fancy science talk for flat face from Greek words that literally mean flat and head, than the chimpanzee face, but not so flat as the human face. Once again, it's transitional. So that's what, like 3 or 4 transitional features depending on how you count, just on the skull of Australopithecus? Seems like what Thomas wants to see has been right in front of him the whole time.
It's just let's do another example. Lucy.
I feel like that's not a different example, but maybe that's just on my end that there's been so much Australopithecus talk. Also, if you're watching this and you're a creationist, a word of advice: using the name Lucy as a stand-in for Australopithecus afarensis or all of Australopithecus makes you sound like you don't know what you're talking about. Just like if I called all humans John because I know a guy of that name, I'd sound like a raving lunatic. Similarly, if someone said they were a big fan of Star Trek and called all Klingons Worfs and all Vulcans Spocks, you might suspect that they actually weren't as big a fan as they said they were. When you call a whole species, or worse, a whole genus by the nickname of one individual, it signals to everyone that you don't actually know much about paleoanthropology. Now, in fandoms, it's okay to not know all the stuff. If you really enjoy the Star Trek you've seen and you're not sure yet what the names of all the alien species are, that's okay. It doesn't make you a fake fan. But what it does mean is that maybe you shouldn't present yourself as an authority on Star Trek lore. Nor are you probably likely to be able to have a discussion about the nuances of the philosophies of Kahless the Unforgettable and Surok in the Klingon language. Similarly, it's absolutely fine to be mostly uninformed about paleoanthropology, and if you are nonetheless enthusiastic about it, that's awesome. But until you know enough to not call a genus or species Lucy when talking about them, you're not really ready to have a discussion about disputes in the field, let alone to challenge well-established aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
The transitional feature that was assigned to Lucy,
as if there were only one,
when it was first popularized in 1974, was Lucy could have walked upright because Lucy may have had the human lumbar vertebrae.
And human-like limb proportions, a human-like pelvis arrangement with a bowl-shaped pelvis that could attach large gluteus maximus muscles, as well as a valgus knee that was shaped to bring the lower legs closer to the center line than would be the case in, say, a chimpanzee, which makes her more stable on two legs, but actually hinders attempts at knuckle walking. So no, it's not just about the lumbar lordosis, although that too is an adaptation to bipedal locomotion that is evident in her remains.
So your lumbar spine, that's in your, where is that? Pop quiz.
I would assume lower back.
Lower
That's
back.
what everyone says with
Yeah.
the chairs and stuff.
Exactly, lumbar.
Way to get it right, Ivana. Yes, lumbar vertebrae are those ones that generally in mammals have no ribs associated with them and that connect to the pelvis. They are actually unique to mammals among living organisms. Reptiles, including birds, don't have lumbar vertebrae and usually have ribs that go all the way back to the hips. Although they usually grow smaller from the shoulders back so that they're quite small by the time you get to the last pair before the sacrum.
So it turns out that ape lumbar vertebrae are shaped and positioned, they're rigid, and their whole back is in the shape of a letter C, just a slight arc to it. So from neck to hip, it's a C.
That's not entirely how I'd put it, but yes, most apes have a single spinal curve, whereas humans have two.
Whereas in humans, it's a letter S. Because we have a lumbar curve that they don't have.
I'm not a fan of using letters to describe this, but sure. He's not wrong about this particular thing, besides in attempting to separate out humans from apes without ever bothering to define the word ape and show how humans don't meet the definition.
So we need to have a transition from the C-shaped back to the S-shaped back. Where is that? Where are those transitional vertebrae?
Actually, this is one of the few cases where I'll say that the transition isn't terribly well documented. Even as early as Ardipithecus, lumbar lordosis is apparently in place. So to see a transition, we need to find an even earlier hominin. I'm skeptical that we will, but then again, since Thomas would call Ardipithecus just an ape, it means he can't use lumbar lordosis as a defining feature of humans as opposed to apes. So at best, he's found one aspect shared by humans and apes that doesn't have a great fossil record. That's not really the kind of thing that helps his case much.
Lucy was claimed to have, this was it, the transitional form here.
It wasn't just a claim, it's a conclusion based on the angle at which the spine enters Lucy's pelvis, which is preserved, and it has been backed up by later Australopithecus finds that include the lumbar vertebrae as well as the sacrum, meaning that we know that Lucy had lumbar lordosis with just as much confidence as we know she had feet, even though those weren't preserved for her either.
But if you look at the original Lucy skeleton, guess what's missing?
I mean, she did have lumbar lordosis, which is an apomorphy of humans compared to other extant apes, while retaining many basal features, most notably the flat nose and small brain of earlier apes. So yeah, although the lumbar lordosis itself was pretty well complete and not really very transitional on its own, what's Thomas's point here? He's not really being clear in what he's getting at.
The lumbar vertebrae, they're not even there. Even though we were told in the
Right.
70s by Donald Johanson, who, by the way, got fame, funding, fortune, and glory, that he still enjoys to this day for the stories.
Yeah, but the anterior end of the sacrum is there, and that's what you need to tell which way the spine is curving when it gets to the sacrum. And it's curving such that the spine would be convex when entering the hip when viewed from the back. Meaning that either Lucy had lumbar lordosis or her whole spine was bent backwards compared to other non-human apes. The second one obviously couldn't be the case because it would mean her whole body was curving back, and she couldn't walk around no matter if it's on all fours or just two legs. Meaning that the remaining option is human-like lumbar lordosis. And later finds of other members of her species did have lumbar vertebrae, and guess what? They all had lumbar lordosis. Just like we know from Lucy. It turns out that if you have one bone, you tend to know a lot about at least the bones that are connected to it on either side. This is a confirmed prediction based on comparative anatomy and evolutionary biology, something that, I'm assured by creationists, is the gold standard in science. Complaining about a confirmed prediction of evolution really does just give up how desperate creationists are. Which is ironic, given how they often project their own desperation and cognitive dissonance onto actual scientists when they proclaim, as they have for decades, that evolution is a theory in crisis.
Transitional, it's transitional. And so we're going, Lucy is becoming human. And that was the narrative.
While I don't like the degree to which the phrase becoming human implies orthogenesis in human evolution, yeah, Lucy is indeed a transitional form, and the lumbar lordosis that is evident in her hips, and that has been later documented with more complete spinal columns that have been found, is part of that. Although it's not the only part.
But his colleagues, plenty of his colleagues, have looked at the evidence since then and have determined, no, there's not even any vertebrae here,
Yeah.
so we're not going to conclude that it was becoming human, that it was turning S-shaped.
No, there aren't any such people. I have yet to encounter anyone who is a publishing paleoanthropologist that would argue that Australopithecus afarensis lacks lumbar lordosis. Now, they might disagree on how much it had, but that's not the same thing. I don't think that Thomas will name a single person making that argument. I would be happy to offer a retraction if anyone can find such a paleoanthropologist, but I can't find one, and it seems neither can the Science Friends, a group which I'll remind you includes Erica, aka Gutsick Gibbon, an actual paleoanthropologist, who herself said to me that she wasn't aware of any such persons.
So, and since then, more of that species, Australopithecus afarensis, have been found, and it's got the C-shaped back. Oh, it was an ape all along.
Except that that's just a lie. A blatant lie. There have been no such finds. In fact, we have specimens like the Taxa child which exhibit vertebral wedges that indicate lordosis. Think about a bundt cake. Any slice you take that involves the line along which you're cutting passing through the center point of the circle, defined by the outer perimeter of the cake, will result in a wedge-shaped piece of cake, which allows you to determine the direction of the curvature of the cake on either side. Now imagine, instead of a single curve, you had a bundt cake that had two curves, one concave, one convex. If you take care to make each slice perpendicular to the curve's tangent, that is, along the curve's normal vector, then the shape of each slice will let you know where on the cake it was cut from. Some slices will be narrower on one side or the other, allowing you to say which part of the cake any given slice is from, provided there's a way to tell which end is which. Perhaps the frosting is put on such that there's a gradient with different colors at each end. This is basically how hominin vertebrae are checked for lordosis. Essentially, the side of the vertebrae where the neural arch is, that is the backside, in lumbar vertebrae, will be narrower if the animal has lordotic curvature, like a human does, and it will be fatter if it does not, like a chimp. Australopithecus lumbar vertebrae essentially display a wedge shape that indicates lordosis. In fact, the paper Lumbar Lordosis of Extinct Hominins by Ella Bean et al., published in the American Journal of Biological Anthropology on November 3, 2011, used a new statistical technique to estimate lordosis in various hominins. Not only did it include Australopithecus africanus among the samples used, it found that it had almost exactly the same lordosis as a modern human, and more lordosis than a Neanderthal, something Thomas thinks of as just being a different variety of human. Now, it's true that A. afarensis and A. africanus are not the same species, but they're in the same genus and very closely related. Members of the same genus don't typically have radically different locomotor styles. It's not like Canis lupus, the gray wolf, walks on all fours while C. latrans, the coyote, goes around hopping like a kangaroo or something. All the evidence I can find indicates that Australopithecus had lordosis that was extremely similar to that of modern humans, and I can't find a single paper that supports a C-shaped spine like Thomas just said that they have. I would love to know where he got that idea, but I suspect it's just his colon.
So that's just another example.
Yeah.
I got more. You want more?
Another example of creationists lying for Jesus. And do I want more? No, not really, but I feel like Thomas doesn't really care about my consent. Although, to be fair, it's not like I was in the room to give it or not.
Let's do one more.
Okay, so another claim about Lucy. And when I say claim, I mean, here is the claimed transitional feature. Human feet.
No, in fact, all analyses of Australopithecus foot anatomy have come away with the conclusion that they are not exactly human, and show a stride pattern that is in fact intermediate between chimpanzees and humans, while also having a human-like position of the hallux, or big toe, that is in line with the rest of the toes starting from the metatarsals.
Human feet? Lucy had human feet? Well, that means if you stick human feet on an ape body, then you're transitioning to human, right? Because at least it got human feet.
And knees, and hips, and spine curvature, and foramen magnum. Sounds like a pretty perfect transition to me.
And then all you need is the human everything else, and boom, you got a human.
Yeah.
But where did we get the idea that Lucy could have had human feet?
Well, we first got it from the Laetoli footprints, which were found in the same area as the Australopithecus afarensis and in the same geological layers, and they showed a presumed family walking along fresh volcanic ash, one larger animal presumed to be male, and one smaller animal presumed to be female, who, interestingly, had extra weight on one side of her body, which has been interpreted as her carrying an infant at her hip on that side. The footprints are quite small, smaller than any adult human, and while they are similar to human prints, all analyses have actually come back with them not being consistent with being made by a Homo sapiens, and instead the footfall pattern and arch shape are inconsistent with humans making the prints. Further, this was confirmed with the find of the aforementioned Taxa child, who was preserved with the distal end of the tibia and fibula, the tarsal bones, and the proximal ends of the metatarsals all in articulation, and it showed that all of those toes were in line. Also, more distal pedal bones were found, just not in articulation, and they fit comfortably with the inline position of the metatarsals. So in summary, we initially got it from footprints that were not easily attributable to any other animal, and then it was confirmed by physical remains.
And it comes from a series of trackways called the Laetoli tracks in Africa.
That's true.
At least initially.
Somebody was walking along in a ash, like right after a volcano. So it's ash-laden mud they're walking on. So it solidified and froze those tracks in place. And they are human tracks.
Not according to any expert analyses that I can find. And when I first covered this claim from the mouth of some pastor, I provided something like 12 sources. I'd suggest you go watch that series. I put a link to the supercut here in this video.
1970, I think 8 or 9, the paper came out in Nature describing these as human.
Nope, that is just another blatant lie. The paper in question is Pliocene footprints in the Laetoli beds at Laetoli, northern Tanzania by M. D. Leakey and R. L. Hay, published in Nature on the 1st of March 1979. Nowhere does it conclude that the footprints are in fact human, and instead connects them with hominid remains from afar, that is, directly with Australopithecus afarensis. The closest we come is in the description in the print section under the primate subsection and the hominidae subsection, where we read, quote, "The longitudinal arch of the foot is well developed and resembles that of a modern man, and the great toe is parallel to the other toes," end quote. Resembles isn't the same thing as being identical. Of course, the paper is linked in the description, but behind a paywall if you don't have access to Nature articles. What you should not do is go to Sci-Hub to bypass it. Remember, do not go to sci-hub.se and bypass the paywall. That is against the rules and very naughty.
Habitually unshod means they didn't wear shoes, and they were upright walkers, just like people.
Okay.
Yep, the animals that left those tracks sure were upright walkers, but that's a problem for Thomas given that the tracks are consistently found to be not made by humans. If it were so obvious that these are just human tracks, surely Thomas could cite at least one peer-reviewed paper that came to that conclusion. Right?
But the problem is it was in a layer that they assigned to an age that was not considered by evolutionary timelines in textbooks to be a time when humans had yet evolved.
No, the age wasn't assigned, it was measured. The rocks these footprints are found in is tuff, that is lithified volcanic ash. That means that like an igneous rock, it can be dated radiometrically, because it's basically both igneous and sedimentary. Of course, the best that creationists have managed to do to try to show that such techniques are inaccurate is to lie to laboratories, misuse the techniques, pretend that contamination doesn't exist, and most importantly, they have a long history of just invoking magic. So until they do better, then the age stands. Further, yes, that's before any known modern human remains. So if Clary wants to go ahead and say that there were tiny modern humans walking around ancient Tanzania, it's up to him to find the bones of such. Until then, he's just making up, which isn't as bad as lying, which he's also done a lot of, but it's still not great, nor is it a good argument. Of course, he'd also have to explain how humans could have left non-human footprints, because remember, all expert analysis disagrees with Thomas that these are consistent with having been made by a human.
So therefore, it had to have been an ape walking like a man because it's the wrong time.
Well, that, and that the prints are morphologically inconsistent with having been produced by a human. You know, that second part is also important.
Well, in the creation perspective, we're not limited by cute little diagrams that someone invented and put into books.
Translation. They are not limited by any need to actually take into account the physical evidence that actually exists in reality. Instead, they're only limited by
imagination.
So we can look at the actual evidence and say, you know what? Maybe these human footprints were made by humans.
That would be a possibility, if they were human prints. But weirdly, creationists haven't been publishing papers arguing that. It's almost like they're content to simply lie about them and not bother actually doing the hard work of science. Because the thing is, creation scientists fundamentally don't care about science. If they did, they'd do science and publish in journals. Scientific creationism is just an apologetics endeavor. It's not here to change the scientific consensus and doesn't really even try. It's there to keep a particular kind of theological conservative pretend biblical literalist within the tradition. That's also why it seems like creationists don't drop arguments until they become so obviously insane that even their co-religionists will dismiss them out of hand. That's why I think we're probably less than a decade away from the major young earth creationist organizations reversing course on feathered dinosaurs and simply accepting that they existed.
Who had human feet.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think that's what they were.
And Thomas is welcome to think that, but what he's not welcome to do is to say that he's right and that the actual experts are wrong, while lying about their conclusions and failing to provide any evidence of his position. Thomas is just being a petulant child who is obstinately wrong and who wants to play Calvin ball with science.
And since that time, more examples of Australopithecines have been found with actual foot bones. And guess what they had?
Inline big toes and arches in the metatarsals. You know, like we saw in the Taxa child. But who wants to bet that Thomas is about to lie to us?
Just like today's apes have hands for feet, Lucy also had hands for feet.
Yep, notice how I can actually cite a fossil that you can check on, and all Thomas has is vague statements that someone somewhere found Australopithecus feet with divergent big toes? Who, Dr. Thomas? Who did that? I can tell you that the Taxa child was found by a team led by Zarasene Almaseged, which is a name I'm sure I butchered, who was working for the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, in the year of our Lord 2000, near the village of Hadar in Ethiopia. Can Thomas give me such information for his alleged divergent toed Australopithecus foot? We'll see.
So the big toe is like a thumb, whereas the Laetoli tracks have the big toe pointing forward.
Yep, an inline big toe, like we actually know, and like I've actually shown to be the condition for Australopithecus. All Thomas has are lies. You know, the verse John 8:44 comes to mind in this case. You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and has nothing to do with the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. When you lie so much, it seems like the Bible says that rather than being the child of God, you're a child of the devil. Now, I don't think that Thomas consciously worships the devil or anything, but if I were someone who were going to take that verse literally, I might say that anyone who lies as much as Thomas does might just be under the sway of the devil, not the Holy Spirit. Fortunately for Thomas, I don't actually think that's how it works. I think he's just a man who really doesn't care about truth, evidence, logic, reason, or science, and only cares about his identity as a particular kind of Christian. But as that kind of Christian, maybe he should look into whose influence he's actually under, given how much of what he says that's just lies.
Only humans have that shape of a foot.
Yeah.
Then I guess this is a human. I wouldn't call it that, but hey, whatever.
So these are human feet, made by humans. That's not transitional. It's just people walking around.
Yeah.
And to support that, Thomas has lied about the actual state of our knowledge of body fossils of Australopithecus, as well as about the actual studies of the Laetoli footprints. If Thomas were right, he could actually tell the truth about these things. He also implied that there's some problem with radiometric dating while not understanding what tough is, and also without actually providing any reason to think that the dating techniques are faulty. Besides basically that he finds them restrictive to his making up a random that makes him feel better. Is this kind of thing actually convincing to anyone? I guess confirmation bias is a hell of a drug.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that one. So what it all comes down to is there's really little evidence for transitional forms.
If that were actually true, then Thomas, over the course of the 22 minutes or so of this interview so far, would have actually been able to do something besides lie about birds and apes. Instead, that's basically all he did. This has possibly been the most pathetic attempt at a rebuttal of the evidence of transitional forms I've ever seen, and I'm a frequent consumer of Kent Hovind material. So that should tell you something.
And if that's the case,
which it's not,
what problem does that pose for evolution, and maybe how does that benefit the cause of creation science?
Ultimately, it wouldn't be a problem per se for evolution. Evolution doesn't require transitional fossils. They're the icing on top. The genetic evidence from just extant life is conclusive on its own. As for creationism, it would be at least a confirmation of the prediction that we shouldn't find such fossils, so I'd consider it to be a minor positive for creation. But that's not the situation we're in. We're in the situation where the evolution cake really does have that icing, and the transitional forms actually falsify all on their own the idea of special creation.
Well, one thing I want to say about these transitions, in every case, an example put forward by our evolutionary colleagues.
He has no evolutionary colleagues. What he's talking about are scientists. They're not his colleagues, because fundamentally, they are doing science, and he is doing blatantly dishonest apologetics. They care about evidence and data. He cares about dogmatism. They can actually be honest with reality. He has to repeatedly lie. They aren't his colleagues. They aren't even his rivals. They are his unambiguous intellectual and moral superiors.
This is a transitional form. In many cases, there's someone who stands to benefit from proposing and defending a new transitional form.
Yeah, and Thomas and creationism at large stands to benefit from denying that there are transitional fossils as we've seen here. But the thing is, so do scientists who aren't the discoverer. Science is all about showing how the other guy is wrong. and doing so while actually taking into account all the relevant evidence and only the evidence, not some Iron Age book. Simply asking quo bono isn't going to help figure out whether or not a proposed transitional is actually transitional or not.
You can get that published because there's thousands and thousands of scientists who want some kind of evidence to support their belief in evolution.
No, there is no actual doubt about evolution and common ancestry. No one thinks that finding a new transitional is suddenly going to be the evidence that demonstrates the truth of the theory of evolution. We're back to Thomas acting like a flat earther, asking why NASA isn't trying to prove the globe. No one in the scientific community feels a need to demonstrate evolution, and that's been the case for about a century now. Transitional forms are interesting because they teach us about the evolutionary history of particular lineages, not because we need them to demonstrate evolution. The time for that has long since passed, and if creationists want to bring that debate back into science, they're going to have to do a lot better than just spewing lies onto YouTube. They're actually going to have to find real evidence and publish about it. And of course, they aren't even really trying. So that's not happening anytime soon. Creationists are taken as seriously by biologists as flat earthers are by astronomers and cartographers. They are completely wrong about essentially all of their distinctive beliefs. They're mostly liars, and the ones who aren't are so colossally stupid that they'd lose a game of checkers to moldy mayonnaise. At least among the ones who actually make it their business to talk a whole lot about this. The average guy in a pew is just believing what people he respects tell him.
That's their bias. They have a bias.
Everyone has a bias, but their bias is in line with the evidence. Thomas's bias is in line with his own lies, and only kind of in line with his favorite ancient literature.
And we do too. And that's okay. You can't get away from biases.
It's true, you can never really get rid of your bias, but that's why science uses peer review to rip apart proposals and research that can't be supported apart from bias. Because other scientists are biased in other directions. That's the whole point of peer review, to get rid of bad results that are still argued for because of bad reasons like bias, ignorance, or lying. That's also why creationists so rarely even try to publish. It's because creationism is just bad reasoning, ignorance, and lying from top to bottom. Indeed, we saw a lot of all of those things just in this talk and the previous one with Trey and Timothy Clary.
But we want to examine those biases themselves.
Yes, we do need to examine those biases themselves. That's why science has institutional methods of doing that. Remind me, what are the methods that creationists use to check to see if they're coming to their conclusions simply because of their bias? It seems like it's mostly nothing.
But for every proposed transition, there's another evolutionist who says, no, I don't think that's transitional at all.
Of course, that's how science works. It's adversarial. And then over time, some proposals get dismissed and others are widely accepted. This is just Thomas complaining, how come science, though? This portrays the fundamentally anti-science attitude that creationism both creates and requires. Because creationism is fundamentally an apologetics, not a scientific endeavor. It is much more akin to theological discussion, where anathemas are handed out and accusations of heresy run rampant, but where there's not actually a whole lot of mind-changing, and certainly no allowable questioning of the dogmas.
It looks like an evolutionary dead end.
Which is irrelevant to a form being transitional. Here, Thomas is mixing up being transitional with being ancestral. Those are not the same thing. Transitional is about the morphology, ancestral is about the actual line of descent. Most transitional forms are not ancestral to modern forms, but they still have transitional morphology and are still similar to the actual ancestors of later groups.
Or it looks like it's fully formed.
That doesn't mean anything.
Where's the transitional feature on that supposedly transitional creature?
Well, as we have already seen, Thomas will look at an obviously transitional species like Australopithecus afarensis, with some half dozen or so very obviously transitional traits, and simply say that he sees no transitional traits, and then he'll go on to lie about it. So what's the point in pointing them out? He's not interested in actually engaging, honestly. But for those who are interested, it's easy to point out where the transitional features are.
And every single one is disputed down the line.
Remember that his only example of this dispute was by referencing, but not even naming, Alan Fiducia, who he said didn't think Archaeopteryx was transitional, even though he does, as you can read in his actual published literature. If this were actually true, you'd think Thomas might be able to do better than lying about scientists he won't even name, thereby making the claim even harder to check on. That's the opposite of how this is supposed to work. He should be open with his sources and name names. I do and have done in this video and the previous 3. Why can't Thomas?
And so we've documented that in our materials. We've got a book called The Fossil Record, co-authored by Dr. John Morris.
Oh, is it the part where we hawk our wares? Well, I have merch on Teespring, linked in the description as well as in the merch shelf below this video. So I don't know, go get yourself a Dapper Dinosaur mug. It's guaranteed to successfully hold a variety of liquids, such as water, coffee, tea, wine, juice, beer, and even bleach. If it doesn't, I don't know, contact Teespring for a replacement. It will not hold liquid hydrogen, though, so don't even try and don't ask.
And Frank Sherwin, and in that it's got an appendix where Frank went through and quoted from the evolutionists themselves. One guy says, or gal, this is transitional, and the next says it's not transitional. And we do that for like 100 examples of supposed transitional forms.
Yeah.
I hope that Frank Sherwin doesn't develop lung disease from all that time deep in the quote mines, toiling away so the creationists can dishonestly pretend that evolution is a theory in crisis, while lying about what basically all scientists quoted actually hold as their position on the transitional nature of various finds.
So what's the takeaway?
That Thomas and colleagues are about as honest as the 45th president of the United States? That's my takeaway.
Evolution needs transitions.
Wrong.
Evolution ought, if it's true, if we came from fish, we ought to see the fossil record have mostly transitions.
I suppose you could argue that that is what it has, if you have a broad view of what's transitional.
But it doesn't. It has mostly fully formed.
Literally fucking meaningless. Seriously, what the actual does that mean? What could possibly be meant by that? Draw me a picture of a not fully formed organism. What does it look like? Who predicts that it should exist? What is the definition of fully formed? Creationists relying on not being able to find core concepts is such a dead giveaway that they're brain-dead morons at best and pathological liars at worst. If you disagree with me, then please let me know where the creationists have actually defined fully formed information and kinds in a way that allows us to actually test and, importantly, falsify their ideas based on those concepts. And I'll issue an apology. But so far, near as I can tell, they don't even try.
And of the transitional fossils that are proposed, they're all disputed.
They're not all disputed as transitionals, though. Of course, that's how science works. It's adversarial. And then, over time, some proposals get dismissed and others are widely accepted. This is just Thomas complaining, how come science, though? This portrays the fundamentally anti-science attitude that creationism both creates and requires. Because creationism is fundamentally an apologetics, not a scientific endeavor. It is much more akin to theological discussion, where anathemas are handed out and accusations of heresy run rampant, but where there's not actually a whole lot of mind-changing, and certainly no allowable questioning of the dogmas.
That's the reality of the situation. So where does that leave us?
Flinging their shit around like a hippo, marking its territory.
It leaves us with a world that looks like it was created with creatures that reproduce according to their kinds, just like Genesis says.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Evolution is a direct assault on the 10 times that Genesis 1 says, according to its kind.
That sounds like a Thomas problem, not a science problem.
In other words, it's supposed to make more of X. If it's creature X, the next generation will be more of that same creature.
X.
It'll be fully formed.
That's what evolution says too. If you're an X, your kids will be X, and so too will all their descendants until they go extinct. That's just the law of monophily. You can't escape your ancestry. Humans are mammals, and all their descendants will be mammals. Humans are primates, and all their descendants will be primates. Humans are apes, and all their descendants will be apes. To think otherwise is to fundamentally misunderstand evolution at its most basic level. Not understanding the idea you're trying to critique is not a good start, and yet it's Thomas's start.
Now, there's variations. You can twiddle with this. There's adjustment knobs genetically that they deploy.
What the f*** does that mean?
Between generations, still do today. But we still recognize a dog, whether it's a coyote or even a poodle.
Well, at least he's not hating on chihuahuas, Dapper wrote, while having such a dog staring at him, hoping that he'd drop a bit of food from the desk he dictates these scripts at. But little did she realize that Dapper wasn't even eating anything, so he wasn't going to drop any scraps for her.
As mutated as they are, they still look like...
Sorry, poodle fans.
They still look like, and you recognize it as a dog. It has the basic dogness to that form.
And here comes the Neoplatonism. I've pointed out several times before that part of the reason that creationists can't seem to understand even the most basic concepts in evolutionary biology is that their concept of organisms is fundamentally Neoplatonic. But modern biology has found that organisms actually cannot be fit into Neoplatonic forms the way that creationists want to. They are simply continuing in the Christian tradition of using ancient Greek philosophical concepts to frame how they see the world. It turns out that, at least in the case of Neoplatonism, this philosophy is wrong when applied to living things. There is not a form of dog. Dogs are a lineage within wolves, and there is no essential dogness that exists. There are just organisms whose genomes can vary over time to any degree, but which won't ever stop being dogs no matter how unrecognizable they might be.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we see in the fossils. We see, according to kinds, type of features on these forms.
When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When all you have is a bastardized pagan philosophy shoved into the shape of a cross, all you see are kinds, or so it would seem.
So in other words, the fossils and today's creatures both vindicate those ancient words in Genesis 1, that creatures reproduce according to kinds.
Mm-hmm.
But only if you lie about them, apparently.
And so evolution is still, after all these decades,
Ooh, is he going to say a theory in crisis? I hope so.
having a hard time finding any undisputed transitional form.
I expect nothing, and I'm still let down.
Boy, if they found one, they could say the Bible's wrong, Genesis is wrong, evolution is true.
No, they wouldn't, because that wouldn't prove that to the many Christians who already do not take Genesis 1 through 11 as a literal historical account. And most scientists don't ever think about the theological implications of their works, because science isn't in some battle for or against Christianity as a whole, let alone some cringe dominionist fringe as represented by most creationist organizations. Scientists are just doing their jobs and learning about how the world works. If that's a problem for someone's theology, that's their problem, not science's.
But until that happens, I'm happy,
I'm not.
scientifically, to say, where's the evidence for transitions?
Well, we leave off with undefined terms and lies. That's fun. Really, this ended up being less honest than even I expected, and I'm a regular consumer of this kind of nonsense. Well, I guess what we can learn from fossils is that evolution is the best explanation for the origin of biodiversity, and that birds are dinosaurs and humans are apes. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovand, Phil Cavara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, Strawberry Vein, Dr. Tapioca Weasel, Elron Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Calvin Brostig Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, and Ballas. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.